Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd please stand, we'd like to welcome the honor guard.
Breathe in. Woo. Forward third. Woo. Woo. 3, 2.
Please have a seat. Welcome to the atrium in Harrisburg City Hall. Today is a wonderful day, a great day in the city's history. It's a day which represents tremendous intergovernmental cooperation. We're joined by representatives of the United States Navy, by John Harris Jr., and of the city to announce that we are formally handing over the artifacts and indeed the timbers of the original Royal Savage, Benedict Arnold's flagship during one of the earliest naval battles of the American Revolution. This ship and its artifacts are now going to be preserved and cherished for the public for generations to come, as they should be. As many of you may know, the ship sank 239 years ago. Actually, it ran aground and was burned by the British, sank into shallow water, and then 81 years ago, it was raised by a sort of amateur archaeologist who had discovered the site. If you look on the wonderful booklet that is on your chair, you can see a picture of them dredging the remains of the Royal Savage out of Lake Champlain. And then, 20 years ago, the city of Harrisburg purchased the artifacts from the original family that had raised them 81 years ago. And for the last 20 years, the artifacts have stayed in storage, out of public view, and we are pleased today to bring them into the light of day and to make sure that they're being returned to their proper care. You're going to hear a little bit as we move forward about the history of the Royal Savage and about its importance to the United States Navy. But I wanted to just begin with a brief reflection on Benedict Arnold, on his later life, because I think it's illustrative of some of the themes that we're grappling with in Harrisburg. As some of you may know, after the Battle of Valcour Island, Arnold goes on to win even more fame at Saratoga, where he badly injures his leg, and he is sent to recuperate from the Battle of Saratoga by being put in command of the city of Philadelphia. If you have seen the American television show Turn, you will know that the season 2 has just ended with Arnold falling in love with the young Peggy Shippen, in charge of Philadelphia, and who knows where season 3 will take us. I think we all know where season 3 will take us. But, and I did invite the actor who plays Benedict Arnold to join us here today, but he is Welsh, as are many of the cast of Turn, British citizens, and they were not in the country. But Arnold, while he is recuperating and in Philadelphia, gets himself into some trouble. And there is a congressional inquiry that is started into the nature of the purchases which he has made while in command of the Royal Savage during the sort of invasion of Canada period. And Congress is particularly interested in whether or not he has the receipts to document these purchases and whether or not he has reimbursed himself with public funds. And they find that, in fact, he does not have the proper receipts, and that he has, in fact, used public funds, and he is essentially fined by Congress £1,000, which would be a lot at the time, and forced to pay them back. So you have the leader of a Pennsylvania city, a governmental inquiry into the receipts and the documentation underlying the purchase of artifacts, and you have a finding of fact, which eventually pushes Arnold even further to the British side. He will eventually, of course, defect, abandon the Americans, and his name will live in infamy. Question we can all think about a little bit is, what will the legacy of Steve Reed be? Will it be a legacy of infamy? Will the similar inquiries, governmental inquiries into his receipt purchasing and artifact purchasing lead to a finding of fact? And how will we as a city heal in the aftermath of treachery and deception? And I think to many in Harrisburg, waking up and finding you're sitting on the verge of bankruptcy, finding millions and millions of dollars in funds sort of expended and wasted, was akin to the sense of betrayal, which Americans felt certainly in 1780 with Benedict Arnold. So we shall see, but the future, one of the interesting things about the Royal Savage is that it represents a paradox. It represents basically the promise of a great general and the early stages of the American Revolution and what is to come for the young nation, and it also represents a sort of eerie foreshadowing of that eventual defection and betrayal. So that paradox's story is similar to the paradoxical story of Mayor Steve Reed's here in Harrisburg. And the question is, how do we heal and how do we find closure for that story? I think one of the ways we do that is by returning these artifacts to their rightful owners, the people of the United States, to the United States Navy. And we begin that healing and that closure process here today. We've got some great speakers for you. I want to start by introducing the director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, the curator of the Navy, Rear Admiral Samuel Cox. He is not only responsible for the Navy's many museums and art and artifact collections, but in his 37-year naval career, Cox served as an intelligence officer, only recently retiring in 2013. His awards include the Bronze Star, the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal, and many, many other military honors. It is my great honor to welcome Admiral Cox.
Mayor Papenfuss, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. The first thing and the primary thing I want to do is to thank you and the people in the city of Harrisburg for transferring these historic artifacts to the United States Navy. The United States Navy takes very seriously our obligation to protect and preserve the heritage of the Navy and our nation, and in particular those artifacts that are associated with the last resting spot of American sailors who gave everything in battle. In the case of the Royal Savage, she ran aground and was abandoned and then burned, so I don't know that there were any sailors who died on board her, but in the Battle of Valcour Island, of which this action was a part, a number did. And at the time, the American sailors were not professionals. They were in many cases landsmen who had been very quickly turned into sailors and came as volunteers to fight in this action against a British naval force that was composed of very well-trained, heavily armed British professionals. So it took extraordinary courage on the part of these Americans to go into that kind of battle. And although it was a tactical defeat, it actually delayed the British long enough to set in a chain of events that led to a major U.S. victory at Saratoga, which brought the French into the war. And basically, had it not been for this battle, even in a losing effort, the history of the United States might have been very different. So these artifacts are a tangible link to those sailors who displayed that courage. And it is that kind of courage that serves as an inspiration to the Navy sailors today as we and they go about their role of defending the people of this country. So these are not just a bunch of old stuff. These are something that is really important to the United States Navy. At the time they were first recovered from Lake Champlain was a time when the Navy and the nation was not as diligent in protecting our cultural and historical resources. We are lucky that these artifacts survived as long as they did. Cold, fresh water preserves artifacts actually pretty well. As soon as they are brought up, the rate of deterioration accelerates dramatically. So the first thing we will do when we take these things back is to go through a process of conserving and protecting so that we can preserve them for the long term. These will not go into our dump, I assure you. And as we go through that process, we will open it up to historical scholarship. Archaeologists and historians have much to learn from this. And as we go further along and preserve the artifacts and get them to the point where they can be displayed, that's what we'll do. I would anticipate some of them eventually going on, loans to other places, which could very likely include the city here, and the museum up at Lake Champlain and other places. So, our intent will be to protect and preserve and then make these available for display to the American people so that they can connect with our history and heritage and have a better understanding of what the United States Navy has done on behalf of our nation. I have to admit that back then it wasn't the United States Navy, it was mostly, Vermont, it was colonial militias, but it's all part of the legacy that led to the U.S. Navy, so we take pride and ownership of what they did. So Mayor Papenfuss, thank you again for turning these artifacts over. As a small gesture of appreciation, I would like to offer you a Naval History and Heritage Command hat. I have left the tag on for two reasons. One, it's made in the USA, and two, it does have the price. So if you do have ethics regulations or something like I have to go through, it's very important to know what this is. So, sir, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And like I said, that's just a small token of our gratitude.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
And if I may now, I'd like to introduce Mr. Art Cohn from the museum up at Lake Champlain, who has done an enormous amount of historical research and work and knows this story far better than I do. And I've already found myself incredibly fascinated by the things he's had to say. So, Art, thank you.
Well, I am so delighted to be here today. I'm here to celebrate, and I'm here also to extend gratitude to the City of Harrisburg and to the Naval History and Heritage Command for their extraordinary cooperation in preserving a hugely important piece of American history. It is a great outcome, and you are to be thanked and congratulated by the American public. Senator Patrick Leahy, who is the senior senator from Vermont and one of the greatest advocates for our lake, has said during a debate about Great Lakes, "I've called Lake Champlain America's sixth Great Lake because of its ecological importance. Historically, however, it is our nation's first Great Lake." And so it's appropriate to ask the question, why? What was he talking about? And so in a very short period of time, I hope to tell you a tale that puts these objects into perspective. Lake Champlain is a 120-mile navigable superhighway stretching north and south between the United States and then British Canada. It was a military route for Native Americans, French, and British, and then during the American Revolution and the War of 1812, figured prominently in the outcome of those wars, later transforming itself into an extraordinary commercial place. Today, if you come visit, you won't see that. You will see sunsets You will see microbreweries. You will see bicycle trails. You will think it's the most beautiful place maybe you've ever been. I invite you to come up on your vacations. But the history that is submerged beneath the waters of Lake Champlain is extraordinary. Our museum, with the help of the Naval Historical Center and Senator Leahy, has located over 300 intact wooden shipwrecks on the bottom of Lake Champlain. That's what happens when people operate around the water. They leave their stuff behind. And if the stuff is left there long enough, it becomes very archaeologically interesting, and we have a bit of an embarrassment of riches. For me, each 4th of July, I look for a story that can connect us to the founding principles, to that story. I think it's one of the great legacies of Lake Champlain that we have so much of this early contact. And it also provides us with a context for the Royal Savage. And our story will begin in May of 1775, 3 weeks after Concord and Lexington, when Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, along with Benedict Arnold, seized Fort Ticonderoga, seized the only 2 large vessels on Lake Champlain, the first of which they christened Liberty. The second they took from St. John, a British sloop, which they named the Enterprise, and wrote to Congress, "We are masters of Lake Champlain." Not because they had a monopoly then on watching the sunsets, but because they then had the ability to use the 120-mile-long navigable highway for invasion. And invasion they did. The British, having been embarrassed and surprised, quickly put a force at the northern end of the lake in Saint Jean, what is today Saint Jean, Quebec. They began fortifying the ground and building warships to retake the lake from the Americans. One of the warships they built is described as a schooner and becomes our Royal Savage, British built in the summer and fall of 1775. The Americans used the lake to invade Canada at the same time, and they laid siege to Chambly, Montreal, and finally Saint Jean Falls, and the 2 vessels that they had gotten floating and fighting to help defend their territory get sunk by the Americans under Richard Montgomery. Those vessels are raised and become part of the American fleet. One of them is the Royal Savage, which is so well built that it quickly becomes the American flagship on Lake Champlain. The invasion of Canada, which includes not only this Army force coming up Lake Champlain, but Benedict Arnold leading a march through the Quebec wilderness, converges on Quebec City, it fails, and in the spring of 1776, not unlike the escape from Dunkirk in World War II, the Americans tumble out of Canada, more dead than alive, sick with smallpox, and they are ferried out of Canada by the 4 gunboats captured the previous year, one of which is the Royal Savage. It brings the Americans back into Lake Champlain, which is now going to be the dividing line. You will not pass, say the Americans. This is as far as you're going to go. And so what you have in 1776 is the classic arms race. British building at Saint John a fleet to take over the lake and invade the colonies. The Americans trying to stop them by supplementing the fleet they already have. Who is going to have the energy and the skill to direct that action for the Americans? A now healed Benedict Arnold, who is placed as Commodore of the American fleet and chooses the Royal Savage as his flagship. He patrols the lake with 15 vessels, convinced that the British will not have the skill and the ingenuity to bring a fleet down to contest him, and he's wrong. And October 11th, 1776, these 2 fleets meet at the Battle of Valcour Island. The Royal Savage and some of the larger vessels get underway early on to engage the British. When they see the size of the British fleet, they return back to the American lines, except that the Royal Savage has already been fired upon, injured, and runs up on a reef at the southern end of Valcour Island. Her crews attempt to use the guns to fire on the British. They're driven away. The British board the boat. They fire on the Americans. They get pounded and they have to leave. 5.5 hours later, this engagement stops only because it's too dark for the two sides to see each other. Arnold writes, 1 hour after the fighting stopped, the gunboat Philadelphia sank from cannon damage. The Royal Savage was lost by some act of bad management. And he starts to hatch a plan to escape, rowing his fleet single file with muffled greased oars and a shrouded light in the back of each vessel. It's a near-run thing. How do you do something like that when the British have set up a blockade to stop you from doing that? At the strategic moment, as if Arnold had planned it, the British decide, hey, you know what? Let's burn the Royal Savage. Let's blow it up. That way it can never be used again against us. And they do that. And a German officer reports in his journal, it made a fine fire which lasted all night. And so the British have created their own perfect diversion for Arnold to escape down the New York shore. Naval historian and theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan summarizes this better than anybody I have ever read. And he says, the little navy on Lake Champlain was wiped out, but never had any force, large or small, lived to better purpose, or died more gloriously. That the Americans were strong enough to impose a capitulation of the British Army at Saratoga was due to the invaluable year of delay secured by their little navy on Lake Champlain. Shipwrecks serve as sacred connections to our past. In the years to come, the Royal Savage and her artifacts will connect Americans and others to the formative days of the United States of America. And again, I want to thank the City of Harrisburg and the Navy History and Heritage Command for their extraordinary cooperation in bringing about this outcome. It's a great day for the American public. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Art, and thank you as well for the work that you did on this brochure for us here today, specially produced for all of you. It's really wonderful. I want to introduce John Harris, but before I do, I want to give a few thank yous. I want to start by saying thank you to our legal department. Neil Grover was here, Doug, Marta, everyone who worked hard to make sure that this would happen. It's not that easy to transfer things back intergovernmentally, but they did it, and they were committed to it from day one, and we've gotten it done. I also want to thank my assistant, Kathy, who helped organize this program here today and did a lot of work to get everyone here. Also oversaw the packing and the transference of all the artifacts earlier this week and insisted on having some for display for the public here, really for the first time. I want to thank the staffs of the congressional offices of Scott Perry and Lou Barletta, both of which are here and very supportive. We've also gotten kind words from our senators and even from Governor Wolf, who could not be here. State Representative Patty Kim and State Senator Rob Teplitz are currently also stuck on Capitol Hill negotiating a new budget for Pennsylvania, so we will forgive them their absence. We wanted to do this week because, of course, it is 4th of July week, and what better way to get 4th of July underway than this ceremony here. Of course, on Saturday, we're going to have a wonderful day on our own island here, City Island. Activities all day for the whole family, and then culminating in a patriotic concert by the Harrisburg Symphony at 8 o'clock, and then fireworks shortly after 9 o'clock. So we'll continue the celebration all the way up through this Saturday, and we hope you can join us there. I thought it was very important to invite my friend and predecessor, John Harris Jr., here to talk just a little bit about the importance of this day and the connections between Harrisburg then and Harrisburg now. So, Mr. Harris, the podium is yours.
Thank you, good sir. I believe I want to call your reference to the rear of the pamphlet that you have received, for there is a button there of most importance to us here in Pennsylvania. One of the buttons that was found upon the shipwreck says in the middle of the button 1BP. That's the way that we would read it today, possibly, but in fact, that button stands for the 1st Pennsylvania Battalion. 1st Pennsylvania was mustered in 1775 of young boys from Berks, Bucks, and Lancaster County, of which we are a part here upon the river until my establishment of Dauphin County in 1785. And so our connection to this fine vessel is that of men from this area served upon this ship after the defeat with Montgomery and Quebec, returning to Fort Ticonderoga for rest and recovery, were then pressed into service as Marines upon these ships in Lake Champlain. And so there, upon this very ship, this very vessel, we find evidence of young Pennsylvania boys who served as Marines on these ships, and especially this particular one, the Royal Savage. I am pleased and proud to know that our young men here from our own area served in such a heroic adventure as the salvation of our great country. May I say to you, as we celebrate the 4th of July soon, on this Saturday hence, for which I shall be reading the Declaration upon my front porch, as I have for many years. I shall read the Declaration at the top of each hour, beginning at 10 o'clock and finishing at 1 o'clock of the hour. That I am quite proud of our great nation once again, that we might hand over such an artifact to our Grand Navy to be recovered so that our history might be in effect maintained, and that our understanding of who we have been as Pennsylvanians might be preserved for those generations yet to come. May we all in our hearts agree, God save these United States. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear. And now, before we take questions and invite you up to examine the artifacts, at which time you can ask more questions, there's some fascinating materials here. We'd like you to stand once more, please, and we're going to retire the colors.
Ready, ready. Who? On earth. Who? Retrieve. Recover. Who?
Please have a seat. Thank you all. And if the media has questions, or the public, go ahead. Portia.
Why were these artifacts purchased in the first place?
The artifacts were purchased by the city of Harrisburg back in 1995, so almost exactly 20 years ago. They were purchased, as I said, from the family of the original archaeologist who unearthed them or took them out of Lake Champlain. And at the time, they cost $42,000, $500. There's a copy received in the media booklet. I'm not going to speculate why the artifacts were purchased, but we certainly do believe that they are now finally finding their proper home. We also recognize the Navy's claim that really these artifacts were never should have been bought or sold, never were Harrisburg's to own. We were simply the custodians through time, and we have now returned them to the Navy, where they will be properly preserved and made available for generations to come. And I'm pleased to say that they are interested in organizing a traveling exhibit. They can travel, among other places, back to Harrisburg. So when next we see them, perhaps it will be with a reassembled Royal Savage in a traveling exhibit here, and we'd be honored to welcome them back.
Do we know how many artifacts will be given back to the U.S. Navy? Or?
Yes, there is a long, detailed inventory of the artifacts that we have. I mean, it's many, many pages. Everything from pewter spoons, which have the initials of some of the original sailors carved on them, to clay pipes. Those hatchets are incredible because they have the original wooden handles. And then you have what I learned today, which is basically bar shot. I was unaware of bar shot, but you can imagine that being shot out of a cannon, twirling through the air and doing great damage to the rigging of ships in a naval battle. So those are just some of the artifacts, but they're hundreds, and they range from larger to smaller. Also, you can see some original timbers from the ship, and if you turn to the back of your bulletin again, you can see the ship in its sort of original semi-intact form when it was uncovered in 1934.
And
Yeah.
lastly, I'm sorry, you mentioned before you were comparing Benedict Arnold's legacy to Reed. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that deception you were talking about?
Yes, I mean, what I was basically making the connection with was how does a nation or how does a city come to terms with treachery, deception, deceit, and ultimately there are many different ways to heal, and I think one of the ways to heal is to remember our history and our past, as they say, so as not to be doomed to repeat those same mistakes again and again. So I think preserving this ship, transferring it to the Navy, also sort of preserves the sort of larger paradox that I was describing of what is both a monument to the promise of a great man and a great general, and also a monument to that sort of eerily foreshadows his eventual deceit and downfall. Yes, sir.
Is there an estimated current value of the ship itself? And I mean, has it been damaged in any way being stored in such a place as it was?
Well, I will say that the city did try, prior to my time in office, to sell these remains at auction, at the auction that was held at Guernsey's. It did not even receive a minimum bid. It was a sort of cut bid, a half bid, and the buyer chose not to go through with the purchase. So from the city's perspective, that sort of established a lack of monetary value. You could say that the monetary value of, would be originally the $42,500 that was paid for, but I don't think anyone's really concerned about that. We're concerned about the historical and cultural value. And for sure, Dave, I think some artifacts were preserved well and in proper climate control at the National Civil War Museum. The timbers, as you know, were left in a shed exposed to the open elements. Although I learned today that the family basically did that for the 60 years after it came out of Lake Champlain before it came to Harrisburg. They were in a barn for a long period of time. So, obviously with today's underwater archaeological techniques, that would be not how things would be stored. But this was a different era and a different time. And I could let anyone comment from the Navy about particular artifacts or the significance of the condition of the ship or anything, if one would like. I think that would be very appropriate. You don't have to. There's no pressure. But could you come up to the? My question would be, as an archaeologist and a historian, what excites you the most about the historical record that's been preserved?
Well, as an underwater archaeologist, I've dealt a lot with ship remains. So I think you know, all the artifacts are exciting, certainly, but the ship timbers are really exciting because there's not that much known about shipbuilding from that time, the ability to interpret the builders' techniques. We also know that the British built according to Admiralty regulations, where the Americans would have been building ships and perhaps by what they perceived as the best methodology and the most economic measure to produce a ship quickly. So there's a chance to, you know, where there are American examples of construction, compare these British versus American constructions. I think we'll also get these timbers back at the Navy Yard. We will eventually record them, both with drawings, scale drawings, and digitally. And I think the exciting thing is you'll be able to reconstruct the shipwreck itself by the timbers, putting them back where they go on the keelson, and from that, perhaps probably digitally, 3D scanning, then create a model of the wreck itself, and then from that you build into a model of the ship itself. So I think that's one of the most important things, because that's an area where there's not a lot of information. Another thing you can look at, if you look at the spoons here, there's the initials of the crew members on the spoons. So they were probably personal belongings. They each carved their initial on it. So it says something to, you can actually tie an object back to an individual sailor on that ship itself. So you can really get some sort of a connection with that individual through these specific personal objects.
Do you want to talk about like how you're going to preserve them condition-wise, or any techniques for storage?
There's a lot of different types of materials here, ranging from organic materials, wood. There's actually a little bit of leather, along with metal objects, and they all survive to varying degrees underwater. But what we have now, we're going to try and preserve by mostly keeping them in a controlled environment, relative humidity and temperature, and separating them by material types. And then once they're actually stabilized, we feel they're ready to actually be displayed, then we'll create probably microenvironments and put them on display.
Are there any more remnants from this ship in museums or stored anywhere else, or is this what is left?
You've answered that? We are?
We do know that the original gentleman who uncovered the shipwreck made it a habit of giving away bits and pieces to special individuals in his life. So yes, there is a degree to which some of the artifacts are sort of scattered throughout the country. Maybe this will serve as a precedent for retrieving future artifacts, which I think would be a very good thing. And, but also the vast majority of the artifacts were owned by Harrisburg. So this is you know, 90% of what is known.
Does the collection include the anchor or anchors of the ship?
It does not include the anchor. Do you know?
I don't believe so, but there are remnants of the Royal Savage in almost every museum around the Champlain Valley, and in a number of private collections as well. And one of the nice things about a situation like this is it becomes a catalyst for a lot of this material to come out of the closet, so to speak. And so I think what you'll see is a really much more robust catalog of what is known, and will tell us a greater picture in the story. And the other thing, of course, is every time a situation like this unfolds, it becomes an opportunity for renewed research. So we will look at the known historical record, and I can pretty well guarantee you that in the next several years will be fleshed out and added to, and our understanding of the boat and its times and the people involved will become much more comprehensive.
And interestingly, I learned today as well that the British came back later in the Revolution and salvaged the cannons. So they were reused during the Revolution itself, and of course weren't left with the wreck.
Exactly when and where will the artifacts be transported? And also, is there any special care that needs to be done just because of the value and importance of the items?
So the artifacts themselves were very carefully collected, packaged, and transported back to Washington earlier this week. They left a selection behind, which we've had in storage here in the building under lock and key, so that we could make some available today for this press conference. I believe there are photos which we can release to the media of the packaging, but let me just say it was a very impressive job. Each piece was individually documented and wrapped and filled an entire Bucks truck. So that was very, very exciting. These pieces will go back today. Again, this is going to DC, where they will be studied and analyzed, and then the hope is that there will be a traveling exhibit that will be created, and we'll be able to not only come back to Harrisburg, but come around Champlain, maybe go up to Canada, and tell the story of this great early chapter in the American Revolution. Yes, sir?
Will any of these artifacts be used in the Attorney General's investigation?
I do not believe so, no. They're going to DC, so if anybody wants them, they are now the property of the United States Navy. They can deal with that. Yes. Any other questions?
Can you have someone
Yes.
address how long it took to package everything up, and also
Yeah.
if all of the artifacts listed on the invoice were found, I mean, did everything?
Fair enough. Yes, that's a good question. Who would like to talk about that? Yes. Okay. Yep.
Yes, I was there on Monday, and we had two teams. One team from the Underwater Archaeology Branch went to the museum and actually packed each individual artifact very carefully with foam, wrapped many of them in bubble wrap because, as you can imagine, a lot of these are very fragile. They did a very good job, and also checked it with the inventory that we had. And at this point, it seems like everything is there and intact. So the other team went out to the warehouse and actually collected the timbers, which is another major effort. The timbers are fairly large. Some of them are 15+ feet long, and they represent a very significant part of the vessel and potentially the vessel's design. And so those were transported back to DC on Monday, and we unloaded them yesterday, put them in a climate-controlled warehouse that we have, and from here they will be cleaned and individually studied, along with the artifacts. And as it was mentioned, this is just a small sample of the artifacts that have actually been recovered, and these will be available for public display. And we have an archaeology and conservation laboratory at the Naval History and Heritage Command, where we have people come in and look at the artifacts, and some of them study the artifacts, and it's a very open environment. At this point, I believe there's 1,300, plus the timbers.
There we go. Excellent. Wonderful. Last call. Yes.
Were the artifacts on display at the Civil War Museum, or were they on storage?
I believe they were all in storage, and I don't know if at any point in time over the last 20 years any of them have been displayed. For all I know, this may be the first time that any of you are getting to see them up close. So on that note, why don't you come up close and admire the artifacts and take this opportunity to ask any questions you may have about them of the experts that are here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to everyone who spoke and participated today. I do think it is a great day for Harrisburg, for the Navy, and for our country.